It's in the works. Okay, so yeah, we are now recording and streaming live on YouTube. I am going to share my screen and get started on a presentation here. So, we'll see if I can anyhow. Okay, so here tonight to talk about the long-range plan, project solicitation, and project prioritization for the state 10-year plan. I regret to inform all of you that we'll have to go through another roll call vote at the end of this, so be prepared for that. I'm going to start off by going through just a little bit of background info. I'm going to go through that fairly rapidly. I will be on the lookout for folks with questions, and I think I built in a couple of breaks in the presentation so I can just make sure that everybody's on the same page and we're all sort of understanding how we're planning to do things and where things are going over the next few months. So as you all know, the planning process in New Hampshire involves 3 documents. We have the MPO long-range plan, long-range transportation plan, which is a 20+ year document. It's sort of the umbrella, gives us our overall goals, objectives, has our entire list of projects that we've identified in the region. Sort of within that, and also outside of it, is the state 10-year plan. Is the first 10 years of our long-range plan, but it also includes all the projects from around the state. Projects tend to flow from the long-range plan to the 10-year plan. And then, of course, the first 4 years of the 10-year plan is the MPO TIP and the state STIP, State Transportation Improvement Program, for those of you that aren't familiar with the acronyms. That is the first 4 years of the projects in the state 10-year plan, as well as in our long-range plan. Those are where the sort of the rubber meets the road, so to speak. That's where projects are implemented. It's where the feds have said that there's funding available and dedicated to the projects that are listed. Whereas in the state 10-year plan, outside of that first 4 years, the state is committed to the funding, but the feds have not committed at that point. And with the long-range plan, everything that's outside of the TIP and the 10-year plan, it's our ideal, what we'd like to see happen, but there's no funding dedicated by the feds or the state at this point to those projects. And so projects progress from concept to implementation as they move through these documents. When they enter the plan, sometimes they're just very general ideas, but we take those projects that are in the plan and we prioritize them every 2 years so that they can get into the top priorities, can get into the 10-year plan. And as part of that, they enter the sort of the statewide queue of projects once they're in the state 10-year plan. Projects are added to the last 2 years, and we of that document, and we every 2 years sort of repeat that cycle of adding new projects, and new projects sort of filter down through and get closer to implementation as they go. And then again, of course, implementation is part of the Transportation Improvement Program. The 10-year plan development cycle and the TIP development cycle are sort of interwoven together and really sort of feed off one another. So this cycle, I'm just going to go through this very briefly. We're just starting the 10-year plan process, and so on number 1 here, where we're doing the project identification and prioritization, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. But during odd numbered years, it's actually backed up a little bit, and we're starting off earlier now than usual. So starting in the even year and going into the odd year, we're identifying and prioritizing our projects. That will go through eventually DOT project review and selection and development of sort of the draft 10-year plan. Then it gets into the GASSET process, the Governor's Advisory Council on Intermodal Transportation, where they review the draft, make potential changes, and that's where we have all the hearings, which will occur next fall. Then once the GASSET has approved the 10-year plan, the governor reviews the document and potentially makes changes to that, and then sends it to the legislature, where it goes through legislative committees, which again may definitely review the document, may make some changes to it, and then it has to be approved by the full House and Senate at the state level, and approved at that level, at which point the governor signs it into law, which just happened a week or two weeks ago, I think on the 24th. Governor signed the current 10-year plan into law at the end of that 2-year cycle. At that point, we start getting into the development of the TIP and the STIP, and whereas DOT drafts the STIP from that first 4 years of the 10-year plan, we draft our TIP and update our long-range transportation plan, and we have our hearings and make adoptions to that, and then we sort of begin the process all over again. The long-range transportation plan development process sort of sits outside of this a little bit, but feeds directly into the starting point of this number one on here. So, you know, sort of overall, the MPO is involved in the first 3 stages of the 10-year plan development and the last 3 stages. So, so our role in the 10-year plan, it's sort of gone through a little bit. We identify regional transportation project priorities. That's the biggest piece of what we're here to do. We provide feedback to DOT and GASIT on drafts of the 10-year plan. We provide input to District 3 of the GASIT on the contents as well. And we present at the public hearings on both our process and our priorities. We also, at the end of the process, again, as I said, we review the draft statewide transportation improvement program and provide feedback to NHDOT on projects that are included in that, or potentially projects that should be that aren't. And then we also work on drafting our regional TIP and updating our long-range plan to make sure all of our project lists are consistent all the way through in terms of timing and cost. And then at the very end of the process, we approve that new 4-year TIP and an updated long-range transportation plan. So when we're looking at the project solicitation and selection sort of piece of this, it's a little bit complicated, and I apologize, this is a graphic that I just kind of threw together, but it really starts from looking at the big picture. We solicit projects from the communities and from transit agencies, but we're at the same time, we're looking at projects that have been identified through corridor studies, through analysis of safety data or congestion data, that type of thing, pulling all those together, and we review and classify them into groups based on the scale of the project. We break them into local scale projects, regional scale projects, and interregional scale projects. I'll talk about that a little bit later in a little more detail. We develop a short list for each of those 3 groups. And then in a couple months, in September, the TAC will meet and derive a single list of priorities from those 3 lists that we're going to then send to, well, they'll derive a list of priorities and make an approval on that to go to this group, the policy committee, and make a final, I guess it's not a final, it's a final candidate projects list to send to DOT for engineering review. So once those are submitted to DOT, DOT will be reviewing all the projects for both cost and like scope and scale and that sort of thing over the fall and into the winter. And then they'll be sending the projects back to us with any sort of proposed revisions in cost or scope or other concerns sometime in January and February. And we'll need to make MPO action at that time on a final prioritized list that is constrained to the budget that we have. And that will happen in March for the TAC and actually February for the TAC at the end of February, and then March policy committee meeting will be our final approvals so that we can submit for April 1st, which is where sort of time frame comes in. Basically just everything I just went through is attached to a calendar here. We are due to send projects to DOT for review by November 6th. We have to have a prioritized, sort of finalized prioritized list to DOT at the end of March or by April 1st, according to statute. So that's the timeframes that we're working with for this whole process. the project selection process is underway right now, as is the criteria weighting process. The TAC reviewed those at their July meeting, and we were talking about them here tonight at the policy committee meeting. Projects will be due at the end of this month to us from the communities and transit agencies. We are in discussion with DOT this whole time to talk about different aspects of the process, and will be as we continue into the winter. As I said, we have to have our draft priorities done to DOT by November 6th. That means at the September TAC meeting, we'll be talking about this candidate project list. At the October policy committee meeting, doing the same and making an approval there. Engineering review over the winter, and then finalizing in the spring for us. Any questions on the background so far? All right, hearing none, I'm going to plow forward. If somebody has anything, we'll have further breaks along to get into that too. So I'm going to start. Thanks. So the first thing I want to talk about as part of the current process and sort of the detail of the current process is the guidance that we've received from DOT on how to move through this. A lot of this should be very familiar to folks. It's a lot of it is the same as we get every cycle. Be adding projects primarily to the last 2 years of the 10-year plan. A slight variation this year, and the DOT has focused that on the construction piece. So what that means is that engineering right away might be programmed ahead of the last 2 years, but the construction phases are most likely to be programmed in the last 2 years of the 10-year plan. So that would be 2031 and 2032. Our target funding for the region is the same as last cycle, about $6.7 million. We must include in that cost our cost inflation at 2.8% per year and a 10% of indirects charges onto that. So that eats up a pretty good chunk of that $6.7 million just in inflation. It's about 25%-ish of the total. We are using a common set of project selection criteria, and you've seen that in the previous communications from me, the overall set of common project selection criteria. Finally, or maybe not finally, next to last, projects must undergo engineering and cost review prior to be adding to the 10-year plan. This can be done by a consulting engineer or an DOT. We're going to rely on DOT to do it this round, as we don't have a consulting engineer on retainer at this point and don't have time to do that. And finally, DOT is committed again to adding our priorities to the draft 10-year plan as presented to them, similar to how it worked last round, with the caveat, of course, that all projects must still go through the GASSET and legislative processes, and therefore essentially are subject to change until the governor signs on the dotted line. So as part of this, we sent out a call for projects to communities and transportation agencies in the region. We did that back in July, and we are looking for a number of things from these folks. First, we're looking to see whether or not projects that they have in the 10-year plan and the long-range plan are still priorities for their community or their agency. Do they have any updated information available regarding those existing projects? Do they have some scope tweaks or updated cost information, that kind of thing? Are there newly identified projects that they want to submit? And we have a new proposal form, a web-based form for submitting projects this year that's been sort of simplified and streamlined a little bit. And then finally, we're also asking if there are other transportation issues that are out there that have been identified that maybe they haven't sort of evolved into a specific project yet, but they understand that there's a problem there that maybe needs to be addressed. And we're just trying to get a heads up on those kinds of things and get them into our planning process. So the next sort of step that happens after the project solicitation ends, and it's actually ongoing now because I'm working with some of the existing projects that we have, is the project development and classification piece. So what we do is we go through the long-range plan and we evaluate existing projects, make sure that we want to keep them, and that, the feedback that we get from communities is part of that. If we hear from a community that a project is no longer a priority, we may remove it from the long range plan. Likewise, if they do hear that it is a priority, we'll make sure that we do keep it in. And then as part of that, we may move projects that don't have a defined scope or a cost to be listed as illustrative. Illustrative means it just doesn't count against our fiscal constraint. And so we can sort of keep a whole list of those projects, but they're just project ideas, but not really projects at that point. So we go through also, we check the data on projects and update it where we have updated information. If we have updated, pavement condition data or crash data or anything like that, we'll add that into the database and make sure that we have the most recent available information about the projects. And then we classify the projects into 3 groups: the local, regional, or interregional group. And it's really the idea behind that is to help balancing the different competing needs and priorities of the MPO from the local level to the larger interregional level. And then I guess the final piece of this that we look at is, is the project a fit for the 10-year plan as a standalone project, or is it likely to be grouped into one of the programmatics that the DOT has listed in the 10-year plan, or is it something that maybe is not a good choice to be funded through the 10-year plan at all? So when I talk about grouping projects by scale, we're looking at really what the focus of the project is and how that differs based on the scale of the project. Local projects are often really focused within a community. They're looking at improving safety or access within that community, maybe by adding a sidewalk or a bike lane or making some other sort of small scale improvements. Whereas on the other end of the scale, these interregional projects are really focused on large part safety, as well as how are our connections to other major activity centers, both within and outside of our region and outside of the state of New Hampshire. How fast and efficiently can you get between Portsmouth and Boston, or Portsmouth and Concord, or Salem and Concord? Those are the types of projects that are happening on the interregional level. Whereas at the local level, mobility is not a big issue. It's not about the speed of getting through downtown, and for the most part, and that kind of thing. So because of that, the project types that tend to be in each of those groups differ a little bit. Whereas you see a lot of smaller scale bike and pedestrian projects and transit projects on the local level, they're on sort of the main street type locations. Whereas at the interregional level, you're seeing them on I-95 and I-93 and 101, and that type of thing. They're on the national highway system roads. They maybe deal with freight issues, as well as they're sort of improving the mobility. The regional scale projects are in the middle. They're on the state highways, but maybe not the largest and most busiest state highways, but they're sort of somewhere in the middle there, and they're really focused more on making those connections between communities rather than within the community. So, and in some cases, because of that, the criteria are weighted differently in each. That equity and accessibility issue is much, tends to be more important, for instance, at the local level, whereas mobility tends to be a more important project selection criteria at the interregional level, and then more of the focus of things. So there is some shift in how those are weighted. And that's part of what we're doing tonight, is setting those different weightings. I'll take a breath here and see if there's any questions or comments on where things are at so far. I'm going to keep you all on mute so you can't. So, all right, I'm going to plow forward then again. Okay, so the project selection process, that's, after the 1st of September, we'll get started on this in preparation to try to get everything ready for the TAC meeting at the end of September, or near the end of September. So we look at a few things. First, we look, is the project feasible? Does it address a defined transportation need? Does it seem to be a reasonable approach in both scope and cost? And is it likely to get resource agency approval? It's not proposing to plow a new road through a major wetland or something like that, which is unlikely to get approved, that kind of thing. Just really big scale kind of stuff that we're looking at. We want to also make sure that the project is supported at the local level, at the very least, that it has some support at the regional and state level as well, and that it, you know, conforms to regulations and plans and those types of things. And that, you know, the application has been submitted, is relatively complete. The third piece that we look at is it eligible for federal funding? You know, pretty much most transportation projects on state highways are eligible for federal funding. When we start to get off state highways, it can be touch and go a little bit. It depends on the functional classification of the roadway. And so anything that's functionally classified as a local road, projects may not be eligible for federal funding outside of things like the Transportation Alternatives Program or the Congestion Management and Air Quality Program, potentially, as well as the Highway Safety Improvement Program. So it sort of narrows the pot of funding that a project might be eligible for. And so we have to sort of weigh whether it's appropriate to go forward for the 10-year plan at that point, which is really looking at broader general federal funding. And then the last piece of this selection process is applying the project selection criteria. So, oh, all right, look at that. I did not realize that it had a this kind of thing in there. So anyways, changes for 2021 in the project selection criteria. I sent out links to this document that's pictured on the right. This is a great new resource that was put together by the 9 planning commissions and DOT, sort of working together on sort of trying to get some additional detail associated with the project selection criteria and the process as a whole. And it really sort of lays things out over sort of overall as to how we're doing things and the various considerations that go into each of the project selection criteria and the process that we're using. So new for this year, we have a couple of new criteria. Economic development is called out as an explicit criterion that we're looking at, as is equity, environmental justice, and accessibility. I'm going to shorten that to equity and accessibility for the most part, since equity and environmental justice are essentially synonyms. And so we're going to just shorten it a little bit to make it easier. On the flip side, the alternative modes criterion that we had for the last several cycles of this has been dropped as a standalone category. That being said, it's most of the aspects of the alternative modes criterion are sort of incorporated into other pieces of the criteria that we're using now. So it doesn't so much go away as it's being shifted into different pieces going forward. So as I said, this new document that we've put together is a more sort of complete and detailed and was developed cooperatively by the RPCs and DOT this spring and into the summer. So yeah, and really need to go change the slide. Oh, and it's just going to keep going. There we go. All right. So getting into the details on the project selection criteria, you've seen this in what was mailed out to you in a couple of different forms. I'm sure I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but just want to step through them very quickly. We've listed them alphabetically so as not to put particular importance on any of them. But economic development is where we'll start. That's broken into 2 pieces, looking at both freight movement and economic development. And you can see kind of the different things that we're evaluating when we're looking at this type. You know, for instance, under economic development, will the project improve accessibility to regional activity centers, such as an employment area or a tourism destination, that type of thing? Whereas when we're thinking about freight, we're looking at, will the project address a freight bottleneck, you know, and somehow make freight movement through the region easier or more efficient. Equity and accessibility, we're looking at both the impact on underserved population, that tends to be folks either communities of color, immigrant communities, sort of the less affluent areas of our region. That's the kind of thing we want to look at and make sure that on one side of things that we're not placing undue burdens on those populations. And then we want to also make sure that we're expanding transportation choice and enhancing alternative modes in this case, particularly for those underserved populations. And then also looking at impact on access and accessibility, and it's all about removing barriers to access. So go through all through these, and I'll just try to go a little more quickly maybe. Mobility, we're looking at both facility purpose, what's the functional class, and then also looking at the mobility intervention, will the project result in some efficiencies or reduced congestion? Natural hazard resiliency, this is one that's been enhanced this year in a little bit more, sort of more detail. We're both looking at the risk or the exposure or the vulnerability to locations to natural hazards as one part of it. And then the second part is, what will the project do that will help to mitigate or adapt to those risks or those hazards? Network significance, this is looking at both traffic volume and the facility importance. And in facility importance, we're talking about how critical is it to the roadway, the transportation network in the region or the state. And volume is very straightforward. We're looking at the volume of traffic on that road. And safety, we look at both safety performance, what's been the record of crashes over the last 5 years, as well as what is the project proposing to do to improve safety. And we have specific measures that we can use to get some estimates about the expected safety benefits of projects. State of repair is looking at both current infrastructure conditions, so we'll look at pavement condition or bridge ratings and those types of things. But it's also looking forward to, does fixing a particular bridge or a particular piece of road, does that reduce future maintenance needs and ease that burden going forward for a while? And then the final piece of this is looking at support, both sort of local, state, and regional level. All right, any comments or questions on that aspect of it? All right, since I've kept you all muted, no is the answer.
Do you see the raise hand function by any chance on your screen? Because I don't, as a co-host, I don't see it.
Yeah, I'm not.
Okay, not sure where that went tonight, but
yeah.
So if you do have a question, you're just gonna have to unmute yourself or wave at us, because for some reason the raise hand function in Zoom is not on our screen this evening.
Well, I think you have to show the participants list. And
yeah.
I can't do that while I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
Right. It'll come up if you hit participants, and then there's raise hand. See if my hand comes up.
Okay. Yeah. I for some reason I can't raise my hand. Maybe that's because I'm a host.
Oh,
Never
yeah.
my hand raised. As long as you guys have that option, that's all I'm concerned about.
All right.
You got it.
All right, we're good.
Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going forward then. So the criteria weighting process, this took place over the week before the TAC and at the TAC meeting on the 24th of July. So I sent a survey out to TAC members, very similar to the one that was used 2 years ago, and asked them to rank the importance of each of the categories, and then under each of that sort of the local, regional, and interregional classification, and then each of the criterion within each of the categories we asked them to set. So so we have to do two pieces with this. We have to both set the category weights, that's those overall big pictures such as safety and mobility, equity and accessibility, those things. And all together, those all have to add up to 100% of the score. And the weight may differ for each scale at the local, regional, interregional level. And as you've seen in what was sent out to you, it does differ. And then sort of within each of those categories, we set the individual criteria weights, and the total within each category has to add up to 100%, and the total of all categories have to also add up to 100%. At the criterion level, at the individual criterion level, we're keeping those same weights all across all three scales. And you've seen the layout of this, so I think you're understanding what I mean by that. So as part of the survey that went out to the TAC members, it did allow them to, and sort of encourage them to make comments on the types of things that they were thinking about or considering when putting their thoughts together on which categories should be priorities. And these are the examples that came in. Making sure that residents all have an easy commute, remembering that it's a forward-looking document and thinking about the future, that there's some overlap in the categories, and that that safety, for instance, might overlap somewhat with hazard mitigation. So they are there is some overlap there, and then focused on continued safety for bike and pedestrian pathways, and then of course the serious problem of decaying infrastructure in this country, and making sure that we're fixing it first. So when we looked at the outcome of the TAC, and this was the results of the survey, and at the end of the TAC, they did approve meaning they did approve this breakdown of the local, regional, and interregional category weights. You can see there is some slight variation between the weighting at each scale. If I think back to the difference between the local, regional, and interregional 2 years ago when we did this, there was certainly more of a difference across these categories. And I think there's a couple of things at play here that have kind of tended to sort of even everything out a little bit. One is the addition of last round we had 7 criteria. This year we have 8, so we're splitting that 100% in more ways. So it tends to even things out a little bit in that case. And I think I could have done some additional prep work, making sure that the criterion and categories were all fully explained, and everybody was fully understanding exactly where we stood on each of these and what they meant. So I think that all ended up kind of creating a little bit of a pretty balance amongst the three weights there. But there are some differences. I think nothing really stands out as huge differences, but there will be some slight differences amongst those categories. So within the categories, we have the individual criteria, and again, each of these need to add up to 100% within each of the categories, and this is how it broke down from the TAC meeting as well. So. In some cases we have a fairly close split, like economic development between freight and goods move, or I guess that's not the closest. Safety, past safety performance versus proposed safety measures is a 48-52 split, whereas in equity and accessibility, making sure that we're expanding transportation choice was a clear priority over removing barriers to access. Everything else was sort of somewhere in between those two. On the support side, we actually have 3 sub-criteria there, so the breakdown is a little bit different. Local priority was important, making sure that it's the project being proposed was a high local priority, that it also included support for regional long-range transportation was a second to that, and finally making sure that if this was a newly identified sort of critical need was also part of that. So these weights are intended as a starting point for discussion. I did update these numbers slightly since the information was sent to the policy committee members last week, basically due to my poor math skills. I was the regional category was adding up to just over 100%, and since we can't have that, and the interregional category was rounding to just under 100%. And basically that was due to the decimal point, the numbers that were behind the decimal point. In one case, there were 3 or 4 of them that were very close to 0.5, and so they rounded up or they rounded down, and that created a slight numbering issue. So I did adjust that slightly. I'll go back to that in a minute so that we can just we can make sure and check it against the what was sent out to you. So the policy committee absolutely can modify this distribution. You know, again, within the constraint that the categories need to equal up to 100%, and the sum of all those needs to equal to 100% as well. So at the TAC meeting, the TAC did endorse the overall project selection process and the criteria weights as presented at the July 23rd, 2020 meeting. Sorry, it said July 24th before, but it's the 23rd. As I said, I did make some slight tweaks to the project selection criteria weights to make sure that everything ended up to 100% since that meeting. And like I said, I'll go back through and maybe point out exactly where those occurred. The action that I need today from the MPO Policy Committee is approval of the project selection process and the category and criteria weights. And as I said, I did just make a slight adjustment to those. And the plan will be that once I get the approval from the Policy Committee tomorrow, I'm going to send out updated information about the project selection process and criteria weights, along with a reminder that projects are due on the 1st of September. So at this point, maybe what I'll do is I'll just run back to these and I will just go through. I need to just bring up a different document to just compare. Okay, so what I sent out to commissioners last week, if we look at the economic development category, there are no changes in that. Equity and accessibility, local stays the same, regional adjusts to 16%, interregional stays the same at 18%. Under mobility, 11, 12, there's no changes. Natural hazard resiliency, the regional increases to 8%, and that is the only change in that one. Network significance, 14, 15, the interregional drops from 15% to 14%. Under safety, there are no changes. State of repair, the interregional drops from 11 to 10%. And under support, there were no changes. So as I said, there were just slight adjustments to those numbers to address my poor math.
You want a motion now, David?
So yeah, at this point, I'm happy to take any questions. If you want to do a motion and second, and then do comments and questions at that point, I'm happy to do that as well.
Questions first.
Okay.
Question, David?
Yes, Glenn.
I see that you have natural hazard resiliency built into the weighting.
Yes.
Is there any, or was there any discussion about including economic related resiliency into the economic development category? And I ask mainly because I realize that this is not it's not a SEDS document, but if you were involved in the SEDS process, EDA is mandating a pretty heavy component in economic resiliency these days. And sometimes projects in this area are related to projects on the SEDS, and I was just curious.
Yeah, no, I don't think that was came up as part of the discussion at all. And you know, maybe it needs to be in there somewhere. And I think you know, if the economic development piece certainly could consider that as part of it. But remember, a lot of these projects are intended to be 10 years out. So often the need for economic sort of stimulus are much closer at hand than that. So I think that maybe is why we we didn't really talk about it because these were all developed in the midst of this COVID crisis. So we're all fully aware of it, but it just didn't really come up as part of the discussion. No.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for David?
This is Dennis Heber. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Dave, I would like to say, I think you and Scott and the full TAC committee and worked really hard on this and did a really nice job in pulling this all together. I just think it's, I've read through all the information you sent out earlier, and looking at this again, I think this is going to set us up very well to have a very fair and good program for our particular district. So I just want to say thank you for all the hard work you did, and I look forward to seeing what comes up.
Appreciate that. Yeah, and that's the idea behind the sort of the splitting of projects into groups is to balance it a little bit so that it's not always just the really big projects that get funded, or potentially even just the little small projects that get funded, that we're trying to find a balance among those things. And when we go ahead.
There is one other question I did have. I think I mean, maybe I misunderstood you, but is there a priority that can change from year to year that can move a project forward or backward on a 10-year program?
Usually, no. Once it's in the 10-year plan, it sort of is in a queue.
Okay.
Construction. That being said, you know, some communities have been able to jump the queue and push their projects to the front through either political sort of willpower, but mostly that happens when a community can come to the table with a bunch of money.
Okay.
Seabrook is probably our most recent example of this. That project on Route 1, just north of Route 107, they've got that added to the 10-year plan. Not this most recent cycle, but the previous cycle, and they were coming to the table with 50% of the funding, and so it got moved right up because it's you know, their funding had a time frame on it because it related to developments. So that's the kind of thing that can move projects around a little bit.
And does that hurt another community when that happens?
Generally, no.
Another project. Okay.
There's you know, Glenn Davison can probably speak to this better than I can, but in the project, with all these projects that are going on in the 10-year plan and the TIP, there's a lot of sort of natural sliding of projects as they're not progressing as fast as they might have been anticipated, or they're not costing as much, or they're delayed for some reason, sort of outside of the control of the agencies involved. And so it tends to be smaller pots of money might open up here and there just because a project, you know, they run into a big right-of-way issue, and so they're delayed a year. So that money that was set for that year for construction maybe is now available for another project to use. So I think it may, in rare instances, require a project to get moved sort of against this will, maybe to say. But mostly I think it just happens with the natural sort of slide of projects around as you know, these things all take time. So.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
I think that might be it, David.
Okay.
Do we have a motion, folks?
Move to approve the project selection process criteria and category weights.
I'll second that.
Did everybody hear that? Could you repeat it, Dave?
Okay, I'll move to approve the project selection process, category, and criteria weights.
And do we have a second?
I'll second that. This is Peter Coffin.
Okay, good. And Tim, would you like a roll call, please? I don't know if David, if you can do it.
I got it. Sorry, I had to unmute myself again.
That's all right.
Assuming there's no other discussion, so I'll just do the roll call for the approval of the motion and the second. Richard.
Yes, sir.
Glenn Koppelman.
Glenn?
Sorry about that.
I don't know if he's there.
The vote is yes.
Are we unmuted?
All right. I've unmuted everybody that they will let me unmute. So, okay, so we got Glenn, all right, Tim Moore,
Yes.
Glenn Davison,
Yes.
Beth Morrow,
Yes.
Lucy Cushman,
Yes.
Bob Donahue,
Yes.
Phil Wilson,
Yes.
Ann Carnaby,
Yes.
Andy Brubaker,
Yes.
Dennis Hebert,
Yes.
Tim White,
Yes.
Jim Doggett,
Yes.
Mary Allen,
Yes.
Barbara Kravitz,
Yes.
Gwen English,
Yes.
Peter Coffin,
Yes.
and Peter Britz. I think Peter Britz is there somewhere.
Yes, I said you can.
Okay, got you. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's all right. Change my headphones.
All right, that sounds like it's unanimous.
All right. Nice job, David.
All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
Mr. Bogle, Salem, Darien, Manchester Transit. Informational
All
transit
right.
presentation. Now I don't know if you folks know, but he was on Good Old Chronicle last night. So we've got a TV star in front of us.
I saw they rebroadcast that. Somebody texted me a screenshot from it.
Yeah, you asked him to rebroadcast. What are you talking about?
I've been lobbying them for months, Richard.
Excuse me, Richard.
Yes,
This
sir.
is Andy. I thought I saw Barbara waving her hand in front of her face. Did she have a question?
Barbara,
I did.
thank you, Andy.
David, was there any discussion or will there be at least some discussion of the problems that come with a project that comes close to the total amount that's allocated to the region? And as whether DOT will recognize that as a separate problem that might really needs to be addressed, because there are some projects that just get pushed off indefinitely, even though they have a high priority.
Yeah, we ran into this last round too, where the sort of the top scoring project was a project that was greater than our regional sort of target allocation was. So at that point, we had to make a decision as to, do we fund the one big project, or do we fund 5 or 6 or 7 smaller projects? And at the time, that was the decision was made to fund the smaller projects. But we've been trying to have that conversation with DOT, and they're sort of stuck as well. There's not a lot of sort of free money floating around in the 10-year plan to fund these $7 and $8 and $10 million size projects. So it's a sort of continuing discussion that needs to happen, and we need to sort of find a way to sort of balance that as well, because those are often sort of major project needs, interregional needs, like interchanges and that type of thing that do need to get addressed, but we can't necessarily fit them in the regional allocation. Some of the other MPOs have sort of taken part of a future cycle share to pay for some of those projects if it's close. So we could potentially use our 6.7 million and then take $1 million or 2 or 3 from the next cycle to apply to that project. And then next round, we would just be working with, half the amount or something like that. That is an option as well.
I'm glad to hear that. I do think that it's a worthy, serious discussion, and I'm hoping that Glenn Davison will smile and see if we can at least try to address that.
Yeah, David's right. It's part of it is you get these bigger projects that are multi-regional and fund them. It's really, we need to get to that project into the legislature and make it more of a mandated project, help us find funding sources or allocate funding sources towards those projects. But David said there is always an options of funding a project over several cycles, a 10-year plan. We do have some RPCs that are doing that. Southern New Hampshire did that, the bigger project, and they actually gone 2 and maybe up to 3 cycles to pay for the bigger project. But it is a regional priority, and that's what they chose to do. So there are options in the Planning Commission.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barb. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, David. Scott, it's you.
All right. First, one other option is we communicate with our legislators about the need for additional revenues to support these projects. All right, let me share a screen here.
Tim, hey. There's light on your face.
Yeah, I put the lights on. It's getting dark out here.
Okay, so this summer we're starting work with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission to update the Coordinated Public Transit Human Service Transportation Plan for the Greater Derry-Salem region. There are probably many of you on the policy committee remember prior cycles of this. Thing that's going to make this cycle different is that we're actually combining the plan for the Greater Derry-Salem region with the plan for the Greater Manchester region, because the 2 regional coordinating councils for those 2 regions merged this past year. So these coordinated public transit human service transportation plans came in as a federal requirement, I believe, with Safety Lou 2 transportation bills ago. And
Scott,
what's that?
You're not sharing any screen. Are you aware of it?
Are you not able to see my screen?
No, I'm looking at everybody else.
Huh. Okay. On my end, it looked like.
There you go.
There you go.
All right.
It's coming up.
Oh.
All right. You got it now?
Right, now I've got a bunch of.
There we go.
There it is.
Got it. Got it.
Okay. And do you see the
4 pictures
version that is just the slide, or the slide and the next slide too?
There's a slide with 4 pictures.
All righty. Okay. So these plans are a prerequisite to be able to access a couple of different funding streams through the Federal Transit Administration that are critical to supporting particularly transportation programs for older adults and individuals with disabilities. These need to be updated every 5 years. The plan for Derry-Salem and the plan for Manchester were last updated in 2016. So we're getting a start on this in late 2020 and we'll finish in early 21. In the eyes of Federal Transit Administration and Federal Highway Administration, this is an MPO document, but functionally speaking in New Hampshire, these are developed and implemented by the regional coordinating councils for community transportation. And these regional coordinating councils were established back in 2006, and most of them crossed regional planning commission boundaries. So in most cases, you have multiple planning commissions that are involved in administering these regional coordinating councils. This is a map of the split out of the regional coordinating councils around the state. There are 2 of these that we've historically participated in. One of them shows up in pink as Region 10, which covers the greater Seacoast area. It's also known as the Alliance for Community Transportation, that RCC. And then the other is Region 9, the Greater Derry-Salem region, which we've worked on jointly with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission and CART. In the Seacoast, we worked jointly on that with Stratford Regional Planning Commission and Coast. What happened this past fall, along with the merger of CART and the Manchester Transit Association, is that we merged the Region 8 Greater Manchester RCC with the Greater Derry-Salem RCC. And one of the major reasons for that, aside from the merger of CART, is that there's a lot of overlapping membership. What you see here is the current membership of the combined Region 8-9 RCC. Those agencies that are in black were members of the Derry-Salem Region 9 RCC. And with the merger, we've added Manchester Transit Authority, which now oversees CART, Bedford Caregivers, which are part of Catholic Charities, and then towns of New Boston and Goffstown. The town of Derry, town of Hampstead have historically participated. The two regional planning commissions, Easter Seals, Rockingham Nutrition Meals on Wheels, and then the Salem Caregivers Volunteer Driver Program. So the basic federal requirements for this include starting with an assessment of transportation needs for populations that are most likely to have unmet transportation needs, including individuals with disabilities, older adults, lower income families. We also inventory current services. What are the different public, private, nonprofit transportation services in the region, and characterizing those in terms of when they operate, what their service area is, who are eligible riders, what service costs are, and so forth. And as part of that, we then can identify service gaps. We need to develop strategies to address those gaps, and then also identify coordination strategies to reduce or eliminate duplication of services and be as efficient as possible, particularly with how federal funds are used in the region. So let me say a bit about the opportunity for coordination. Traditionally in New Hampshire and in a lot of other states, transportation services have been fairly siloed. If you look at this and think of the blocks on the top line as being the Department of Transportation, maybe the yellow funding agency 2 is the Medicaid program through New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. The green box, agency 3, is, say, the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services. Funding agency 4 might be a municipality. Across the middle row, you have agencies that provide transportation, say CART, Easter Seals, Meals on Wheels, a volunteer driver program. Each of those provider agencies has contracts with multiple different funding agencies. And then each of those organizations is providing their own service to a specified set of clientele. The ultimate goal when we started talking about coordination over a decade ago was to move towards a model that looked more like this. And this has been used in some other states where you have a regional transportation coordinator, essentially a lead agency in each region, and funding from each of those funding agencies passes through that central coordinator and then goes out again and funds direct bus operations, contracts with some contracted carriers, volunteer driver programs, mileage reimbursement for volunteers, perhaps taxi voucher programs. I think the ACT and Coast region is the region in the state that over the last 10 years has come closest to this, where Coast has actually taken their call center that they used for their ADA paratransit service and now schedules trips for the Ready Rides volunteer program, for Rockingham Nutrition Meals on Wheels. I think the Stratford CAP agency is likely soon going to join that. There have been a number of challenges to doing this in other regions. One of those is that the State Department of Health and Human Services has not come to the table. They've run their Medicaid funding through separate brokers. They have been resistant to running their Bureau of Elderly Adult Services Title IIIB funding, resistant to changing how that's allocated. You also have issues with non-contiguous service areas or non-overlapping service areas of different providers that may cross RCC boundaries. And then complicated funding puzzles where the money that comes from Health and Human Services is not enough to actually cover the full cost of the service provided. And so say Meals on Wheels has to privately fundraise the bulk of the balance that's needed to keep their service on the road. And so it would be problematic if the contract from BEAS was shifted to another agency. So that said, there's a range of coordination strategies ranging from fairly simple to fairly complex. And on the simple end, you have just providing information and referrals. If one agency can't provide a ride that's been requested, they'll refer them to another agency that they think will be a better fit. Sharing policies and practices, sharing vehicles, for example, on up to consolidating, really consolidating services. And actually that service consolidation has been more the pattern in the Derry-Salem region. Going back to 8 or 10 years ago, Meals on Wheels consolidated some of their service with Easter Seals. Easter Seals operated the cart service. And so all of that was operating out of Easter Seals call center. More recently, CART and MTA have merged. And so there are efficiencies, substantial efficiencies there. There have been some other landscape changes for the region as well. I talked about the merger of CART and MTA and the merger of the RCCs. The RCC has had a contract in the last year with Easter Seals to do some mobility management work, which has included outreach to provider agencies, transportation provider agencies that aren't currently participating in the RCC, trying to get them to the table and to increase interest in coordination of services. Also talking to medical centers and other agencies that may not provide transportation services directly, but may purchase them on behalf of their clients. Another change that has come up in the last few months is that the newly signed 10-year plan actually flexes about $2 million a year from the CMAQ program over to meet unmet transit need. And some of that money, much of that money will go to the fixed route service providers like Coast and MTA and Nashua. But some of that, our understanding is, will likely be distributed through the RCCs to fund services like volunteer driver programs. So there'll be some additional resources to work with as we think about strategies to prioritize in this round of the plan update. I noted with consolidation of service providers, something that has just happened in the last 2 months. Lamprey Healthcare, Senior Transportation, or Lamprey Healthcare has decided to step back from their transportation services that they have provided for a decade and a half or 2 decades, and are talking with Rockingham Nutrition Meals on Wheels about taking over those services. So that is an opportunity for coordination right there. And then finally, last but far from least, is in this update to the plan, we'll need to talk about, what are the short and long-term implications of COVID from a funding standpoint, from a standpoint, say for volunteer driver programs. Those volunteer driver programs are reliant on volunteers who are, in many cases themselves, older adults at greater risk for infection with COVID-19. And so the volunteer driver programs have been experiencing problems with volunteer recruitment. So the elements of the plan update process, we're starting in updating the survey instruments that we used in the last cycle. The last cycle, we did 3 surveys, one of transportation providers in order to develop that profile of existing service, one of municipal welfare or human service officers to get their input on what they perceive as unmet transportation needs in their community. And then a third of other nonprofit health and human service organizations that don't provide transportation services, but work with populations likely to have unmet transportation needs. There's a demographic analysis component of this that draws on typically American Community Survey data. I've just been going through the latest 5-year data compilations through the American Community Survey. We also get funding, or we get data from the Medicaid program, from other programs within the Department of Health and Human Services as to service levels, number of clients in the target communities that the plan covers, to give some sense of volume of need. Out of that, we identify service gaps, updating and refining strategies. In this case, will include integrating the strategies from the 2 separate plans, as well as identifying potential new needs and new strategies. This then goes out for a 30-day public comment period and ultimately is brought to the MPO for adoption. In our timeline for this, we're working on survey instruments now. We'll look to field those in September. Similarly, working on demographic data now. Should have the survey results compiled, analyzed by October. We can start working on the service profile that'll run. Work on that will be October, November timeframe. Then looking at service gaps, November, December, in the late fall. Consolidating the existing plans and looking at strategies through January, February into March. We would first then get approval of that draft from the RCC, begin public comment in March, and then ideally be able to bring that to the MPO for adoption at our April meeting next spring. And then as part of this also, we'll be consolidating and updating the 2 regional transportation service directories that we had previously developed for the Greater Derry-Salem region and for the Greater Manchester region. So that's the thumbnail of the work we're just getting into. I'd be happy to answer any questions on that.
Even though it's a presentation, David, Scotty, would you want us to do anything?
Not at this point. We don't need a motion to proceed with this. As I update our information on the local welfare officers, if those have changed in some communities, I may be in touch. And along the way, if you have any comments on need in your own community that you think we should be aware of, please give me a call or shoot me an email.
God, it sounds like the biggest blockage to this program working is the the agencies that don't want to give up their funding source. You mentioned one agency, I can't remember which one, a welfare type agency that didn't want to give up their control of their funding structure. And that
yeah, I mean, there's oh, sorry, go on.
No, just gonna say, it sounded like you're gonna kind of need everybody's buy-in in order for this to go through. And I'm wondering what you think of the chances of getting that from some of these more larger bureaucracies.
I think there's been progress with the Department of Health and Human Services in the last 6 months. And I think they are, I don't think that they're seriously considering wrapping Medicaid funding into running that through the RCCs. That was one of the concepts 10 years ago. And then the department decided to go separately with their managed care brokers hiring their own transportation brokers. And that's actually become more splintered in the last year than it was before. I think some of the other Department of Health and Human Services programs are now looking at trying to coordinate better. I noted that, you know, one problem there is that I think in some states where that really centralized coordination model has worked well are states where there is state money available to cover the full cost of the services. And so in that case, it's just a matter of where does that state money go? In New Hampshire, the pattern has been that there's grant money that covers a portion of the cost of the services, but then it's up to the local agency to fundraise the balance. And so if, for example, the Bureau of Elderly and Adult Services were to take the contract money they currently have with Rockingham Nutrition Meals on Wheels and shift that over to a regional transportation coordinator, you know, into this coordinated system, the problem would then be, okay, who then fundraises the balance that's needed to make the service whole. And so that this all seemed very like a no-brainer when folks started talking about this years ago, and in working through the process, it's been more complicated. I think in the coast region, they've made really good progress, and I think we'll gradually see more and more agencies decide to shift their ride reservation and scheduling through coast. As funding gets tighter, that forces agencies to, you know, reconsider their operating procedures and patterns. And I think we're seeing agencies decide that this makes sense for them.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Scott, thank you very much. And I'm not sure who's giving the project updates, either David or Tim.
Dave, do you have that? I don't actually have it in front of me. I think you guys had that memo that you put together today.
Yes, I do have that in front of me. You want me to put it up on the screen or?
Your call.
Should do that. Easy enough to do that. Maybe. Okay, we'll send this out after the meeting. It's the usual memo that we do and hand out at the meetings, just sort of going through some of the projects that are going on in and around the region or the state that we think, you know, you might be interested in. And maybe I'll just touch on some of these on the first page, and Scott can touch on the ones that he needs to. 10-year plan, as I said, was adopted on the 24th last month. There's a web link there to get you to see the current 10-year plan. There's also a document on that list that shows you all the changes that were made and at what stages of the 10-year plan development. So changes made by the legislature, or by the DOT, or GASSET, and those sorts of things. Road Service Management Systems data collection, or that's RSMS. Essentially, this was sunk by COVID. We can't have multiple people in the same vehicle, and you need 2 people in a car in order to do this data collection. So we held off on doing that this year, so far at least, and it looks like probably this whole summer will be a wash on that. The Kittery Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Joint Land Use Study, that was the planning study that was completed. I guess it was either late last year or early this year by the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission in coordination with the town of Kittery and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, looking at land use and transportation and other issues around the shipyard to sort of make sure that they remain good neighbors and are working together to solve regional problems. That is shifting into a new phase now. They're going into project implementation. And RPC has been asked to be on the implementation committee. And so we'll be continuing to participate in that. Scott, do you want to touch on the shoulder study? And then you already did.
Yeah, sure. Over the past year, we've been working on a study for the town of Rye to develop recommendations for priorities for shoulder widening on town roads. That has been in large part a mapping task that Christian has worked on, and also going out and doing some field data collection. I finished writing up the draft report to the town beginning of July. They've been reviewing that. Monday night, I gave a presentation of the findings to the Rye Select Board. And I think we'll probably get a few comments from town staff and should be able to wrap that up shortly. There was a community survey component that was originally proposed for that to get public input on priorities as residents see them. That survey was originally going to go out in the late winter, early spring, and then with COVID, the sense of town staff was that they would rather wait till things settled out with COVID. So we're waiting to see whether that survey happens in the fall or later on. I just talked about coordinated public transit, human service transportation plans. Moving on to the next page. Bicycle and pedestrian counts. We've had our eco counter automated bike ped counters out on rail trails this summer. Did a count on the Rockingham Recreation Trail in Newfields. In July, had them out on the Old Eastern Marsh Trail in Salisbury, Mass, and the Clipper City Rail Trail in Newburyport. Obviously outside of our region, but those are contiguous sections of what will be the East Coast Greenway, and having data on trail usage in those communities we feel is useful in developing estimates of likely usage in Seabrook and Hampton Falls and Hampton on up to Portsmouth. I just set the counter out in Epping last night, and we have an extra one that's shared among all of the RPCs that will go out on the trail in Raymond in the next couple of days. And then after that, we'll have them out on the rail trail in Salem, and likely work jointly with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission to do a coordinated count on the rail trail in Windham.
Nice numbers.
Yeah, I was particularly impressed with the numbers in Newfields, particularly given that the trailhead parking is extremely limited there, and so it showed that there's a lot of use. Actually, that's been something that's shown up with COVID, is there's been such a boom in people wanting to use trails and bicycling and walking in general, that it's highlighted the need for better capacity at trailheads. And I think the local group in Newfields that does some of the maintenance there is working with the State Trails Bureau to try to get a larger parking area built on state-owned land that's immediately adjacent there to Rockingham Junction. Public participation plan, we're nearing completion of an update to our public participation plan for the MPO. The first part of that was essentially updating the wording to formalize use of virtual techniques like Zoom for public meetings. And then we're also adding performance measures for our public outreach work. And I think we'll be going out for public comment on that shortly, and ideally we'll have that to bring back to the policy committee this fall for adoption. Oh, and Plan New Hampshire webinar tomorrow morning. I am part of a panel on a webinar for Plan New Hampshire talking about impacts of COVID-19 on transportation and housing. So George Reagan from the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority will be part of that, talking about housing. I'll be talking about transportation. Sylvia Von Aulick from Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission will then be sort of knitting the two together. But that'll run from, I think, noon to 1:15 if anybody's interested.
Great, and thanks, Scott. Finally, the last piece on here was the Seacoast Transportation Corridors Vulnerability Analysis. This is a project that we're working on using Coastal Zone Program funding, and we're building off the work of Tides to Storms and Sea Rise projects that we did back in 2016 and 2017, 2015 and 2016, somewhere in this range. So we're sort of taking the next step. We, in those previous projects, identified the locations that were likely to be impacted by sea level rise. And now we're looking at specifically the transportation impacts of those at those locations. You know, what roads, you know, what segments of roads are likely to be impacted, how severely are they likely to be impacted, and our goal is to prioritize and produce a set of priorities for addressing and mitigating or adapting to those potential vulnerabilities. You know, there's some other aspects of the project as well. We're hoping to sort of use this as a way to fine tune the natural hazards resiliency project selection criteria that we're using for the 10-year plan, and hoping that this can inform that process and make improvements to that, as well as hoping to get some detailed analysis done on at least a few of the locations, looking at, and we're partnering with folks at UNH to do some detailed analysis of like impacts to the road beds from groundwater rise or sea level water intrusion and that type of thing. So it's a pretty ambitious project, and we're working through it. We have a community advisory committee, and we were able to meet once before COVID hit, and we are preparing and trying to do another meeting in September, late September, I think, potentially early October, to meet with that committee again and try to make some further progress on that front. I already sent this memo out to you via email, so you have it in your hand, or at least your email, your inbox. So if you have any further questions about these, we can either talk about them now, or you can contact Scott or Tim or I individually after the meeting.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Any other business or public comment?
Richard, if just very briefly, the September meeting will be our next meeting. Looking at resurrecting the March agenda that we had, which was our meeting that was canceled due to the COVID issue, where we talked about, we were planning to have a number of people speak about energy, offshore wind, and a number of other energy related topics. There's also the possibility that we could have a staff presentation on the project that Dave was just talking about, as the timing might be right for you to hear a little more detail about that Seacoast Vulnerability Corridor analysis.
Sure.
Other than that, I just very briefly on the office, we are still largely working remotely. You know, Dave is in there, as you can see from his video. Ned is in there most days, and I'm in and out in the off hours. Going to continue this for the time being. The governor has continued the state of emergency. And my understanding is that's likely to continue through the fall, or he said possibly till there's a vaccine. So what that does do is if he continues that state of emergency, it enables us to continue to meet remotely. And I think what we'll do is have a discussion at the upcoming executive committee, just to get a sense of what the executive committee feels about where we're at, and what we should do about, you know, cold and flu season hitting in a couple months and how that might complicate matters with this whole pandemic. So stay tuned for that. But otherwise, the staff is doing a great job. We're managing to work remotely very well. I think we're learning and improving as we go. The one thing that's been missing, I think, from the staff is sort of that water cooler chat, if you will, and we're attempting to emulate that with some of the technologies that we have. So, you know, it's all about keeping everyone connected and communicating, and we're doing the best we can in the circumstances, and so far so good. So
How's our revenue stream?
revenue is, budget's fine. You know, we've got plenty of budget for the upcoming year. My concern isn't so much this year as it is the following year, with communities and dues. Given I think the sort of the tail end of this COVID issue is going to hit you all in your budgets on the local level, especially next year. And, you know, we're going to have to prove our worth and go out there and make sure that communities understand the value in the RPC. So our work is going to be cut out for us, I think, in the upcoming budget year.
Did you get a chance, not to talk out of school necessarily, did you get a chance to finish going around to the towns?
Not entirely, no, not before the COVID hit, but I do have, and I don't want to go too far into a lot of details, but one thing that's been going on is the Seacoast communities that were dealing with the beach openings have formed a weekly meeting, which consists of several Board of Selectmen members, town managers and others, and I'm part of that. And I'm actually thinking of replicating that around the region. Essentially trying to have like a monthly or quarterly or bi-weekly meeting, essentially of like local officials to discuss various planning issues. This has worked out really well. It started all about opening up the beaches and all those logistics, but it's turned into talking about transportation, the 10-year plan, voting, a whole host of issues that have come up. So I've got an idea and a model in mind that's going to hopefully put us out there a little bit more, even in these circumstances. So, and that's on the executive committee agenda as well.
Yeah, good idea. Anything else, folks?
That's all I have. That's it.
I'm listening. I don't hear it.
Motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn.
Oh, there it is. Oh my God.
Richard,
Yes, sir.
if you would like to avoid Tim having to do a roll call, you can just declare the meeting adjourned.
Oh, I can. Oh my God.
Yeah.
All its power. It's adjourned.
Thank you.
That was
Second
easy.
that.
You need to add a slight amendment to what Glenn said. You can say that, and then if anybody objects, you have to do a roll call.
God, I hate him.
I mean, the phrase is usually the meeting is adjourned without objection. And if nobody objects.
Glenn, you can't hear anything, can you?
What?
No, I can't, yeah, no.
You can't hear anything, Glenn, can you?
There's a rabble rouser in every crowd.
I know.
I like that role.
Oh, I know.
Cheers, everybody. Stay healthy.
Night.
Say good night, Dick.
Bye.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Night.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Night, John, boy.